Good morning. Good to see you. No movies today, but we are looking at one who made no movies, but a movie, several were made from his works. How many of you, let's just start with, have seen one or more of the Hobbit or Lord of the Rings movies? Okay, how many of you have read one or more of those books? Most of you as well. Good. I'm not going to give a summary, and I'm not going to worry about spoilers. I read the books a long time ago, 25 years ago maybe. I knew that the movies were coming out whenever it was before the movies, and I thought I want to experience these first in the books before the movies tell me what they should look like. And the movies are really wonderful, and I've seen them many times. One of the downsides is now when I go back to read the books, you see the pictures from the movies. Now, Peter Jackson did it very well, but read those 25 years ago. There are lots of resources, as you can imagine, on Tolkien, on Lord of the Rings, especially in the last 20 years. This is an older book on the Inklings, Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams. Not sure if this particular version's in print anymore. That is mostly about Lewis, but talks about Tolkien. This is a standard biography of Tolkien by the same man who wrote The Inklings there, Humphrey Carter. And some more recent books that deal with the ideas in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. This one is by Jonathan Witt and Jay Richards, who are Catholic. Came out 2014, The Hobbit Party. It's an interesting book. The Vision of Freedom That Tolkien Got and the West Forgot. So it talks about what can we glean about Tolkien's views on government, economics, the market. That's a good book. And also by a Catholic, Bradley Berzer, who teaches at Hillsdale. J.R.R. Tolkien, Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth. If you were to get just one book, I might get this one. It has, the first chapter is a nice short biography and then looks at many of the theological themes. And then another one which is shorter and also very accessible from Phil Ryken, PCA, president at Wheaton. The Messiah Comes to Middle-earth, Images of Christ's Threefold Office in the Lord of the Rings, and we'll talk about some of these ideas. So those are just some. There are many other books on Tolkien. It is a remarkable fact, an arguable fact, but we'll call it a fact nonetheless, that the two most influential Christian writers of the past 100 years were not preachers or pastors or theologians, but Oxford professors with a particular interest and expertise in medieval literature. They were also close friends, though not without several rough patches, which we'll talk about. They both fought in World War I. They both saw their work as something of an apologetic for traditional Christianity specifically, and more broadly for the Western tradition. And they both wrote enduring works of fantasy and myth. I'm talking, of course, about C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Estimates of book sales are hard to come by. They vary widely. I should say estimates are easy to come by. Firm numbers are harder, but the number most repeated is that Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, the whole set, has sold around 100 million copies. I like to say that between Kevin DeYoung's books and the Chronicles of Narnia, we've sold over 100 million copies. His other books total about the same together. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings has sold 150 million copies, with another 100 million copies of The Hobbit. So you put Lewis and Tolkien together and you add in unauthorized versions, translations, and sometimes difficult to count the whole set versus the individual volumes, and you are easily north of 500 million sales between Lewis and Tolkien. Now, there are good reasons to cover either or both of them. And so you may say, why not do Lewis? Lewis is a Protestant. Tolkien is a Catholic. Well, one, Doug Falls has done an excellent course before here, Sunday school class on C.S. Lewis. I also think that we're probably more familiar with C.S. Lewis. And in talking about Tolkien, I wanted to find someone. I debated, should I have in these last 500 years, should I just admit I'm only going to talk about Reformed people, or I'm only going to talk about Protestant people, or should I try to at least have one representative of the Catholic Church, one representative of Eastern Orthodoxy? And so I tried to have at least one, not your typical theologian, pastor, pope, church leader, but the most significant writer. And no doubt, the most significant Catholic writer, at least the one most read, the one that most Protestants have read in the last 100 years, is certainly Tolkien. And next week we'll come to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's the most influential, you could argue, member of Eastern Orthodox. So we don't think of him as Russian Orthodox. So we're looking at Tolkien. We could look at Pope John Paul II. He's likely the most consequential Roman Catholic pope of the 20th century and one of the better popes since the Reformation. But Tolkien is most read, and Lord of the Rings is mainly, we're right to see it as a Christian work, but there are some specific ways that we might see it, and Tolkien saw it as a uniquely Catholic work. J.R.R., John Ronald, then Rule, went in his younger days by Ronald. Tolkien was born January 3, 1892 in Bloemfontein, which is not in England. Then it was the capital of the Orange Free State, now a city in South Africa. Why were the Tolkiens there? Tolkien's father, Arthur, had left Birmingham, as we call it, Birmingham, the United Kingdom, years earlier, sort of at a dead end in his career. He went to work for the Bank of Africa. He became a bank manager, and they moved to Bloemfontein, or he did. And then his wife, Mabel Suffield, moved there, and they got married in Cape Town in 1891. J.R.R., or Ronald, was born a year later, you can see, in 1892. He had a brother, Hilary, not a sister, but a brother, Hilary, who came 2 years later in 1894. After Ronald, again, we're talking about later, when he grows up, I'll just call him Tolkien, but for now, to distinguish him among the rest of his family, when Ronald was sick as a baby, Mabel then was forced to leave Bloemfontein and return with the two boys to England in April 1895. So just as a young boy, he's sick. So the family left behind the father, Arthur, and the family was never together again. Arthur contracted rheumatic fever, and Mabel was trying to come back and see him and tend to him, but before she could make the trip, he died, sadly, alone, in February 1896. So the family now is left in Birmingham as they return to be where Mabel was from. Ronald then had very little remembrance. So his father died in 1896 and didn't remember much about his father or about his time in Africa, except later he said he did remember being bitten by a tarantula, which then played into his spiders and Shelob in the lair as Sam and Frodo make their way to Mount Doom. So Mabel and the two boys settle back near Birmingham in a little village. Almost sounds like it could have been Hobbiton, a little village named Sarahole. And this village will become the inspiration for Tolkien's depiction of Hobbiton in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings. He loved his upbringing there, the British countryside and the farmland, the simple life in this village town. He loved everything about the woods, the lack of industrialization. He grew up there, but he didn't stay there for very long. Mabel at first homeschooled their sons, filling their heads with languages and fairy tales. Then the family had to relocate to Birmingham so Ronald could attend the posh King Edward's School. Had a rich family member who enabled them to attend this school. Ronald, take heart, parents, was not a stellar student, but here's where perhaps our taking heart finds a more discouraging turn. The reason he wasn't a good student is he was only interested in teaching himself Norse languages, as all of our children have been. He was passionate about Northern European languages, so much so he couldn't bother himself with getting good grades. Shortly after moving from this village, Sarahole, outside of Birmingham, to the city itself so they could attend the school, something very significant happened in the life of his mother. So this is his mother, Mabel. She converted to Roman Catholicism. According to Tolkien's later recollections, his mother was treated very poorly by many of her Baptist family and friends. Some people pulled their financial support, others heaped scorn and derision upon this young widowed mother. And this would affect Tolkien for the rest of his life. He considered his mom a martyr for her Catholic faith, and he always struggled with harboring deep resentment toward Protestants, which stemmed back from how he felt like his mother was treated by some of her family and friends and by many in the Anglican establishment, and the way that Tolkien, as a Catholic, was something of an outcast at this school. So he harbored deep suspicions toward Protestants. Later, Mabel gets terribly sick. 1903, is diagnosed with diabetes. She regains her strength, leaves the hospital, but not for long. Later that fall, she falls into a diabetic coma, and she dies in November of 1904. So you can do the math. 12-year-old with a 10-year-old brother. Both the boys are orphaned. So where do they go? Their mother and father has both died. Mabel had developed a friendship with the local parish priest, and so she left in her will that the two boys were to be taken care of by Father Francis Xavier Morgan. Father Francis. He helped pay for their boarding school out of some of his own resources. He was strict, as Catholic priests sometimes are, but Tolkien looked back and was very favorable toward the experience with Father Francis. Now, it's not that Father Francis had to, take them to school every morning and go to all of Ronald's soccer games, different kind of life. He paid for them to go to boarding school, and on the summers would take them on some holidays. While at one of these boarding schools, Ronald is 16 now, he meets a woman named Edith Bratt, who is 19, 3 years older. She's another student at the boarding school, also an orphan. Father Francis saw this budding romance between Ronald and Edith, and he didn't like it. And so he forbade Ronald from seeing her until he was 21. 5 years you have to wait before you can officially see her or date her. In October 1911, Ronald began his studies at Exeter College in Oxford. So he's a student at Oxford. He had won a small scholarship there beginning in 1911. He's a 19-year-old. Earlier that summer, before he heads off to school, he had embarked on a trek through Switzerland. Bilbo's adventures through the misty mountains were inspired, he said, by his time that summer in the Alps. That's what the picture he had in his mind. Now, while at Oxford, Tolkien continued to be passionate about philology. That was his number one, philology. which is philo, love, logos, words, the love of words, the study of words and languages. He loved words. While at Oxford, as he continued this, he ended up majoring in language and literature, graduated with first-class honors in 1915. Now go back, 1913. So 1913, how old is he? 21. As soon as he's 21, he writes to Edith to declare his love for her and to ask for her hand in marriage. No beating around the bush back then. Just, hey, haven't talked for a while, love you, let's get married. To his great dismay, she was already engaged to someone else. She had assumed that Tolkien was done with her, wouldn't come back, but he quickly won her affection. Sorry for who the other guy was. On January 8, 1914, Edith, somewhat reluctantly, was received into membership at the Catholic Church. So we'll see this, that Tolkien was a very devout Catholic his whole life. In order to marry his wife, she had to be his wife, she had to become Catholic, and she never really took to it like her husband did. Didn't like confession, didn't eventually stop going to the Mass. They did send their 4 children to Catholic boarding school, but she became Catholic, though didn't stick quite as much. Like her husband, they devoted themselves to the Catholic faith, though with differing approaches. They were married March 1916, 4 children they would have: Christopher, Priscilla Rule, John Francis Rule, Francis named after Father Francis, and then Michael. Less than 3 months into their marriage, so they get married March 1916. You know enough world history to know what is going on in 1916. World War I, 1914 to 1918. Ronald, 3 months into their marriage, in fact, this is one of the reasons they got married, because he was already a part of a battalion, and they knew it wouldn't be long before he'd be shipped off. They wanted to get married before he left. And so the beginning of June, he is shipped off to France to join the Allied forces in World War I. They arrive in northern France just in time for one of the worst battles of the war, the Somme offenses, or the Battle of Somme. The first days were some of the worst defeats, the most bloodshed for the British Army in its entire history. It took place over that summer and into the fall, this Battle of Somme. So this wasn't just a day or 2 or a week, but a series of months. As many as 1 million men were killed in the Battle of Somme. Tolkien had alternating time over those months, sometimes being billeted in a nearby village. So you'd have some time and you're in some house or some inn, or you're in some barracks, and then you'd take your turn and you'd go to the front line in the trenches. So Tolkien served in trench warfare for about 5 months until he contracted, as many men did, trench fever, which is just sort of a catch-all term for fever, sickness, probably dysentery, all sorts of things that rendered you unable to serve. And so he was shipped back to the UK. Remember, you're fighting in France. It's not that far to go back to England. And so he would spend the rest of the war convalescing in and out of hospitals. He'd be in the hospital, he'd be about ready to go back, and he'd get sick again. And then when he was finally ready to go back in 1918, mercifully, the war came to an end. In this book, Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, which came out in the early 2000s and then was revised in 2023, he says at the beginning he wants to correct one significant mistake. He says in the first edition, he noted that Tolkien was not a very good soldier. And he says in the second edition, he was informed by others who said, every man who survived felt like he wasn't a very good soldier. He got sick. He was in the trenches for 5 months. He was, as lots of his countrymen, brave and faced those horrors, and he lived, unlike many others, including some of his best friends. Many of those images and experiences in the Great War shaped Tolkien's writing. The eerie silence right before a battle. If you think of the movie scene at Helm's Deep, and they just see the enemy approaching, and the elves have come, and the men are there, and they're at Helm's Deep, that mountain fortress, and then a drop of rain starts falling. It's that eerie silence. I always watch that and I think, can I be underground like with the women and the children? They need a chaplain or something down there. I do not feel very brave. The devastation of modern warfare, also struck by the male camaraderie shared by soldiers facing a common evil. One of the great tragedies of our day, which has now become so sexualized and so transgressive, is that we hardly have a category for deep love between men. And so people hear, Sam and Frodo, well, they must have been closeted homosexuals, because we don't even have a category for men side by side, weeping together, loving each other as they face this common foe. You also get a picture in The Lord of the Rings for what Tolkien and the soldiers found, the joy of basic comforts like being able to drink tea or finding an extra pinch of tobacco somewhere. Most importantly, and we'll come back to this at the end, he was deeply impressed by the loyalty and the bravery of the common soldier. Tolkien was an officer, and so he was given what they affectionately called a Batman, that is a personal assistant to the officer. The Batman would oversee domestic affairs. He was also the runner during the battle. The simplicity, the honesty, the loyalty of these men would be the inspiration for Frodo's unflappable, loyal friend and supporter, the virtuous Samwise Gamgee. That's what he saw and wanted to write into the character of Sam, and we'll come back to that. After the war, Tolkien returned to Oxford, where he worked for 2 years. Now, this would not be a dream job for most of us, but knowing Tolkien, he worked for 2 years with an editor for the Oxford English Dictionary. Wow. He was in heaven. He got to research old words and find where they began. This was before it had, for the first time been published. Years later, they would ask him for one entry, the word hobbit. He worked there for 2 years. In 1920, he accepted a teaching position at the University of Leeds. 1924, he's named a professor there, the youngest one at the time. In 1925, then he moves back to Oxford, and this time for good. So he was a student at Oxford. He did some tutoring at Oxford. He returns to Oxford in 1925, and that's basically where he will spend the rest of his life. One of the things I love about these studies in history is you see there are so many different ways to make a difference for the Lord. Some of the people we've studied traveled all over. Some of them were dynamic speakers. And then you have someone like Tolkien, who lived pretty much in the same place for his entire adult life, and what he did was write some books that have been read by millions and hundreds of millions of people. This time, from 25 to 45, Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon and a fellow at Pembroke College, so the universities have different colleges. In 1945, he becomes the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature, a fellow at Merton College, holds that until 1959. So he teaches at Oxford 1925 to 1959 until his retirement. What can we say about Tolkien the man? Have you ever seen a picture of him? He's neatly dressed, slightly round in older age, as often happens. Not physically impressive, about 5'9". Students could recognize he was scholarly and brilliant, and they said if you sat in the very front row and you really paid attention, especially when he kind of went off script, you could get some nuggets of inspiration. But they also, the word around Oxford was he was a very mumbling lecturer. He was not a dynamic teacher. People didn't have extreme, so C.S. Lewis, the students tended to have very extreme responses to him, and we'll get to Lewis in just a moment. They were very different personalities, where Tolkien was, we like the guy, there's some good stuff, he's a bit of a mumbler. Many people remarked, and I saw this in several of these biographies, the first thing you noticed about Tolkien was an immediate kindness. He was, one person put, appealing jollity and the soul of affability. He loved to talk, but he did not talk down to people. He could talk to you and talk about all the things he was learning, and he talked to you as if you knew all the things he was talking about and were his intellectual equal. He loved to play pranks on people. He was a doting father, charming. His son Michael, this is the youngest, reflected later, I have simply looked upon my father as a far more interesting, far more kindly, even far more humble man than any other I knew, and whose intimate friendship I was privileged to enjoy. Now, we don't have Michael's comments when, say, Michael was 16 or something, but, later, that's a good thing to say about your father. More interesting, more kindly, more humble than any man I knew. As I mentioned, he was a devout Catholic. He went to confession before Mass. His wife Edith did not like that. She eventually stopped going to confession and stopped going to Mass altogether. He did not like at all the changes brought about by Vatican II. So there's the Vatican Council and then this major Catholic synod in the second half of the 20th century called Vatican II, where the watchword was, there was a long Italian word, but it means fresh air. They wanted a breath of fresh air to blow through the Catholic Church. And depending on who you asked, it was very fresh or it was new all right and didn't smell very good. If you were a traditionalist like Tolkien, you did not appreciate the changes from Vatican II. So no longer were the priests supposed to do the liturgy in Latin. You say, why in Latin? The people don't know Latin. Well, but they were supposed to do it in Latin. Well, now they weren't. Tolkien would recite the liturgy loudly in Latin, even as the priests were saying it in English. He felt, he said, at times like a refuge or a refugee trapped in a revamped Catholic Church. He was shocked that now the Eucharist might be attended, quote, by dirty youths, women in trousers, no offense, and often with their hair unkempt and uncovered. And he said, now the people have to suffer through, quote, stupid, tired, dimmed, bad priests. He did not like the mechanized world, and you see this in Tolkien's vision of Middle-earth. He was an early environmentalist, though not of the human-denying kind. He was not a misanthrope, as many environmentalists are. But one author said, in any dispute between a human and a tree, he always took the side of the tree. And you see his love for the woods and for nature and for the ents and the trees. He did not like the mechanized, industrialized world. He loved the countryside. But, lest you think, well, he just was in love with the rural countryside, who wouldn't be? Remember, though, in Lord of the Rings, the rhapsody with which he describes the white city of Gondor and all the people. And so he wasn't anti-city, but he always loved the home he grew up in, at least for those few years, Sarah Hole outside of Birmingham. He gave up driving in the 1940s, some say because he was a terrible driver. His wife always feared for his safety and for others. He was better walking, better on a bicycle. He was a man who wanted to live in a different realm, and so he invented that realm. It was much easier for Tolkien to make up languages and mythical history than it was for him to actually write those ideas into a book. It was much easier for Lewis to write his books than Tolkien. Tolkien took 8 years on The Hobbit. He had the Silmarillion, which I have not read, I know. If you're a real Tolkien nerd, you've read the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion, he actually wrote most of it before The Lord of the Rings. He said this was his most important work. This is where he develops all of these elvish languages and words and this huge backstory, except then it wasn't even a backstory because he didn't have the story. He had to write Lord of the Rings based on all of this history that he had first written down in the Silmarillion. But he was a perfectionist. He was constantly inventing new things and deeper stories behind the stories. It was hard for him to get his work down on paper. When he published The Hobbit, 1937, it was an immediate success. Of course, the Hobbit there is named Bilbo. He thought about naming the Hobbit Bingo. Would have sounded very differently. He named it Bilbo after the town, Bilboa, Spain. He had a sword from there. It's one of the reasons why he gives so much information about Bilbo's sword, the one that shines blue when orcs are around, named Sting. Tolkien later reflected, what's a hobbit? He made up hobbits. He said, you want to know what a hobbit is? Me. He said, that's me. I'm a hobbit. He said, I like food and drink. I like to sleep in. I like wearing waistcoats. I don't consider myself very brave. I grew up in this village, and that's where I want to live. After The Hobbit was published in 1937, it was an immediate success. The publisher wanted a sequel. And Tolkien had been working on this for years, the Silmarillion, and so he brought it to the publisher. The publisher said, I don't even know what I'm looking at. We got story upon story. We got languages you invented. I don't think this is going to work, or at least not anytime soon. And so, in order to give a story for the Silmarillion, he wrote The Lord of the Rings. He didn't want Lord of the Rings published as a trilogy, but it was too long, and so they released it in 3 volumes over 3 years. Toward the end of his life, he made his son Christopher his literary heir, and so after Tolkien died, Christopher, with the help of others, painstaking detail. Went through his father's papers and letters and unpublished notes and manuscripts and journals and scribbling, and tried to, and put together and finished the Silmarillion. Christopher was insistent this was not a combined work with me and my father. This is my father's work. I simply finished it by pulling together the pieces that he already had in existence. And that book came out in 1977, initially set sales records, but it didn't grab the public's imagination quite like The Lord of the Rings. Any of you read the Silmarillion? Yeah, I have it. My son has it. I haven't read it. Not nearly as many people have read it. One person reflected, I said, I don't remember if it was Lewis or someone else, Tolkien, people like reading Lord of the Rings, and they like to know that there's depth behind the story, but they didn't want to go in and get all of that depth for themselves. It was enough to hear something about Numenor or Isildur's heir, and oh wow, that seems really cool. There's a backstory. They didn't need hundreds and hundreds of pages of the backstory. But if you really want to understand what Tolkien was up to, he considered this his most important work. In the 1960s, Edith's health began to decline, leading to her death in November 1971. 2 months later, Queen Elizabeth, she was around for a long time, honored Tolkien by making him a CBE, Commander of the British Empire, a great honor. On September 2, 1973, Tolkien died, 81 years old. On their tombstones, for his wife is the name Luthien, and on his tombstone, Beren. You have to read the Silmarillion to know the connection. Luthien was an immortal elf maiden from the Silmarillion, similar to the Arwen-Aragorn storyline in Lord of the Rings. She was an immortal elf maiden, and Beren was a mortal man, and Luthien gave up her immortality in order that she could be with Beren. So you know you are fully invested in your myth when you put your elvish names on your tombstones. Let's talk about the Inklings and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. They first met at Oxford in 1926. Lewis had the much more dramatic personality. He was more intense. Students tended to love his classes or hate him and find him kind of boorish, not boring, but boorish. He drank more frequently than Tolkien. By some accounts, he could smoke up to 60 cigarettes a day. He smoked incessantly, a couple of packs, and smoked a pipe. On September 19, 1931, Tolkien, Lewis, and another friend named Hugo Dyson, stayed up all night talking about Christianity. Lewis became convinced that Christianity was like the pagan stories and the myths that he loved so much, except that in Christianity, God really did live among his creation. This was the avenue that Tolkien and Dyson took to try to convince Lewis to be a Christian. Lewis had become convinced that the New Testament was basically reliable and those things happened. And they came about the Christian faith to say, you know, these myths, this Christian story is the true myth, meaning this is the one that actually happened. All of these other stories that you love are but a pale reflection of the real fairy tale that has come true. Christianity is about the real things, the story behind the story. 12 days later, Lewis wrote to a friend, I have just passed on from believing in God to believing in Christ, in Christianity. I will try to explain this another time. My long talk with Dyson and Tolkien had a good deal to do with it. Tolkien, however, very glad his friend became a Christian, was disheartened that he did not become a Catholic. Instead, he became an Anglican. Tolkien and Lewis were very close. For better part of 2 decades, they were almost the closest of friends. But their differing views, Anglican and Catholic, were a source of enduring tension. Tolkien thought Lewis was prejudiced against Catholics. The most scathing piece that Tolkien wrote about Lewis was a piece called, see if you can get this jab. He called it the Ulster motive, as in Ulster, because he was an Ulsterman. Where's Ulster? Ulster is northern Scotland. So Lewis was born Belfast, northern Scotland. So he said Lewis had inhabited the ulterior motive, that prejudice that Protestants in Ireland have against Catholics. That was his charge. Tolkien did not care for the arguments in Mere Christianity. He really did not like Letters to Malcolm. Tolkien especially didn't like that Lewis dedicated the Screwtape Letters to him. He said, you know I didn't like that work. Why? He said, and this gives an insight even into how Sauron is depicted. Sauron is depicted in The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien thought it very dangerous to delve too much into explaining evil and the devil. And so Sauron is a presence, is a lidless eye. So he thought it was a very dangerous and foolish thing that Tolkien would do, to try to write a whole book as if he were the devil, and then to give this book to others. For his part, Lewis could use typical insults when referring to Catholics. Bog rats, sometimes they were called. Lewis's brother Warren, who was a part of the Inklings as well, went by the name Warnie. Warnie and C.S. Lewis, who you probably know, went by the name Jack, were very close. Warnie said about his brother, quote, "He considers himself a broad-minded man on the ground that he once talked civilly with a Roman priest and also listened without interrupting a socialist." That's how broad-minded he is. The Inklings was a group formed by an undergraduate at Oxford, and then the undergraduate graduated and left, and the only two original members were Lewis and Tolkien. They had also been a part of another group called the Coal Biters, which was a group that I'm sure you were all a part of, a similar group. They read together Icelandic sagas. Who among us hasn't in college? They combined this Coal Biters group and the Inklings and somehow kept the name and unintentionally relaunched the group with the same name, the Inklings. Jack and Tolkien, to the Inklings, was known as Tollers, or Tollers, that's what they called him. It's hard to constantly call someone J.R.R. It's a little pretentious. The Inklings formed in 1933. The key members were Lewis, Tolkien, later Charles Williams, Lewis's brother Warren. Others like Charles Wren, Neville Coghill, Owen Barfield attended irregularly, and dozens of others would kind of come and go. Tolkien himself admitted the real locus of the group, the energy, the dynamism behind the group, was Lewis. He was the driving force. Tolkien, in fact, was sometimes frustrated with how late Lewis kept everyone out. Remember, Lewis is, until the very end of his life, a bachelor. And Tolkien didn't think Lewis was very mindful of them that had wives and families to return to. And Lewis, for his part, one time said that Tolkien was, quote, "the most married man I know." Well, there's worse things. What did they do, the Inklings? They talked poetry, politics, theology. Sometimes they told bawdy puns. They read books and papers. There was a fairly standard regimen. Lewis would say, "What do we have to read?" And somebody would bring a paper, or they would read parts of Lord of the Rings as it came to be. And they would often be subject to withering criticism from the group. They met formally on Thursday evenings at Lewis's rooms at Magdalen College. Looks like Magdalen, but pronounced Magdalen College at Oxford. Then they met informally on Tuesdays at a local pub. If you've ever been to Oxford, you've probably seen it. You should at least walk into it, the Eagle and Child, famous for where the Inklings met, affectionately known as the Baby and the Bird, the Eagle and Child. They talked, they ate, they drank, they smoked. Lewis once remarked, "Is any pleasure on earth as great as a circle of Christian friends by a fire?" This is a great picture of friendship and something that is difficult for many people in our day. The members of this group thought of themselves as diverse. They often didn't get along, but outsiders considered them politically conservative, religiously Catholic or Anglo-Catholic, and artistically anti-modern. The group met regularly until 1949, less frequently after that. The group disbanded after Lewis's death in 1963. Now, over time, Lewis and Tolkien's friendship grew strained. Bradley Burtzer, in that book, gives several possible factors: theological disagreements. Lewis had a quick and immediate friendship with Charles Williams, the other most famous member of the Inklings, and it did provoke some jealousy in Tolkien. If you remember this famous line in The Four Loves, where Lewis argues that when you add another friend to the group, it doesn't detract from the other friends, but it brings out something new in that friend. And so if you lost that one friend, you've actually lost something of the other friend. I've always found that good and convincing, and Tolkien probably didn't agree with it. He was a little jealous when Charles Williams came into the group, and they hit it off. There were also differences as Tolkien was upset that Lewis borrowed some of his ideas and some of his private mythology in his own novels. Tolkien especially objected at the end of Lewis's life, a secret decision. Remember, he married Joy Davidson, who was a divorced woman from America. Tolkien, strong Roman Catholic, did not believe in marrying a divorced woman. And, this may be hard to believe, Tolkien did not like Chronicles of Narnia, and he did not hesitate to say so. Why not? He thought it was too allegorical. Come to that in a moment. He absolutely was adamant that Lord of the Rings was not an allegory. He thought the Christianity was too explicit in Chronicles of Narnia, and he didn't like the way it got overstuffed with different layers. So, remember in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, Father Christmas shows up? Lewis had this idea, and you see it in the Space Trilogy too, of sort of this fantasy world and the stuff of the medieval past and then Christianity, all sort of, that was his way of saying they're all coming together. Tolkien thought that was the wrong way to write a fantasy. He said it needs to be a self-contained universe, and you don't bring in Christianity from the outside. People often will say, well, Lord of the Rings, it's very conspicuous. There's no religion per se in Lord of the Rings. There's no church. There's no worship service. There's no priests as such. And Tolkien's response was the whole metaphor is supposed to be about religion. So if you put religion into it, then it's hard to see what the whole thing is about. They drifted apart. Lewis got a position at Cambridge, even though he had a home in Oxford. They saw each other less frequently. Sadly, after Lewis died, you may remember he died on November 22, 1963. Lewis died, Aldous Huxley died. It's the day JFK was assassinated. 3 people died famously on the same day. Tolkien declined to write an obituary for his one-time very, very good friend. So there were rough patches in this friendship, and yet they were indispensable for each other. Humanly speaking, who knows if Lewis would have become a Christian were it not for Tolkien? All of our lives would be different. We've all, I think, read something from C.S. Lewis. And who knows if the world would have ever gotten Tolkien's masterpiece apart from Lewis? They both agreed to write fiction somewhat on a whim one night where they were complaining about the lack of stories, and so they said, I guess we'll have to write them ourselves. And they did. Lewis was probably the better stylist, but Tolkien created a much more complicated epic, and he knew how to use simple words for grand effect. His imagination all began with his love of language and his insatiable appetite to invent words and play with names and craft languages, and then he built a story to go with that. Tolkien had no bigger fan and supporter than C.S. Lewis. He was the first one to show any interest in the Silmarillion. He was the first one to encourage Tolkien's publisher to accept The Hobbit. He was the first and most enthusiastic, almost rapturous in his excitement for Tolkien's finishing and publishing The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien started writing Lord of the Rings. Remember, Hobbit, 37. He starts working on Lord of the Rings in 38. He did not publish the first volume until 1954. So any of you take a long time to get something done, you have company. 16 years before it comes out. And when it came out, Lewis, privately and publicly, in print, gave it effusive praise. But for the encouragement of C.S.L., Tolkien wrote to a friend in 1965, I do not think that I should have ever completed or offered publication The Lord of the Rings. He once admitted the whole reason he wrote Lord of the Rings is because Lewis said he wanted a story to go with the Silmarillion. We would not have the works were it not for Lewis. Well, let's just say a little bit about Lord of the Rings itself and about Tolkien's view of myth in our last 10 minutes here. When The Lord of the Rings was first published, it was noticed at first mainly by academics who gave extreme reviews. Some praised it as a great work of genius, and others thought it was overstuffed and a bit of old-fashioned revelry. In the 1960s, the counterculture in America, hippies, latched onto the book. They saw a kind of environmentalism, and they were all about the elves and the myth. Timothy Leary of LSD said, he loved to trip out on acid while he was reading Lord of the Rings. Tolkien could not have been more opposite than a hippie. His personality, his politics, his dress, his demeanor, he was confused. In fact, he said the American fans are more into the Lord of the Rings than I am. He said there is something in the American soil that easily grows into a cult. He was adamant the book was not an allegory. He said there is no inner meaning or message. He said, I did not set out to write, quote, a parody of Christianity. So on the one hand, you can certainly argue it's not a Christian book. And as we'll see, Tolkien admitted many times it was fundamentally a Christian book. Maybe the best way to think of it, Tolkien said, is Middle-earth is pre-Christian. That is, it's not trying to be a paint by numbers and this stands for that, but it's telling a story and a history, the symbolism of which will then be fulfilled in the real history of Christianity. It was profoundly shaped by a Christian ethos and symbolism. He told a Jesuit friend, the book, quote, is fundamentally religious and a Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. One time somebody asked him to list the most important influences in Lord of the Rings, and number one, he said, his Catholic faith. He told Clyde Kilby, Wheaton, American evangelical. Interesting, he told his Jesuit friend, it's a Christian and Catholic work. He told his evangelical friend, quote, I am a Christian, and of course what I write will be from an essential viewpoint. One of his best friends said, it is undoubtedly a profoundly Christian book, and that's how Tolkien saw it. So be careful. Don't think of these as allegories, as secret codes, but think of these as symbolism that Tolkien, with a Christian framework, couldn't help but put into the Lord of the Rings. This book from Ryken, for example, he wasn't the first to come up with this. There was an article in the 1960s, and Ryken here has developed it into a book to see the threefold offices, prophet, priest, and king. Gandalf is the prophet. He's the seer. He doesn't know the future, but he can cast a vision for the future. His words, that you shall not pass to the Balrog. He's the prophet. Frodo is the priest. He's carrying the ring, which is the punishment, is sin, into the fires of hell in Mount Doom. He's the priest with the sacrifice. And of course, the king is Aragorn, who is awaiting to return and take his place on his throne. As I've noted several times over the years, you see something about the perpetual incarnation of Christ, that in Christ's ascension, Christ in heaven is still fully God and fully man. So when you read in Lord of the Rings, shall Gondor yet have a man to sit on the throne? Yes, there is a man who can sit on Gondor's throne. The return of the king, prophet, priest, and king. The elves are something like angels. They're blessed with supernatural insight, with power, immortality, and yet there's something missing from the elves, a joy or a pleasure that can be true of mankind, things into which angels long to look. Faramir is a man who knows his calling, stays faithful to his station in life. Sauron, the devil, the ring symbolizes power and the corruption of power. Mount Doom is the belly of hell. Mordor is evil personified in sky and rock and terrain. He wrote about his description of Mordor. I remember miles and miles of seething, tortured earth. He's writing about trench warfare in World War I. Perhaps this is best described in the chapters about the approaches to Mordor. It was a searing experience. The lembas bread that sustains you, gives you life, strengthens you. The orcs, remember, they encounter the lembas bread. They don't know what it is. We ate nothing but maggoty bread for 3 days. And they find it, and they don't know what to do with it. Tolkien later admitted, yet this was like the Eucharist. He later acknowledged that Galadriel bore some resemblance to the exalted Virgin Mary. So that's maybe the most Catholic part of the vision. The ring. Tolkien later acknowledged this was intentional. You would have missed, many of us, that the ring was given a date. The ring was destroyed on March 25. 9 months from March 25 is December 25, Christmas, the day of Jesus' birth. So traditionally in the church calendar, March 25 is 2 dates. It's the Annunciation, that is when the angel announced to Mary that she was with child. That makes sense, 9 months later. And according to church tradition, Christ was crucified on the same day that he was conceived. So March 25 is the Feast of Annunciation, and it is traditionally held to be the date of the crucifixion. And Tolkien acknowledged, yes, he put the destruction of the ring on March 25 as a symbolism of Christ's destruction of evil and sin on the cross. There's a pro-fertility theme, you'll be very glad to know. So his environmentalism was not of the human-denying kind. He will remark, signs of decay were that the high men of the south married late and their children were few. Faramir tells Frodo about the decadent age where, quote, childless lords sat in aged halls, and the last king of the line of Anarion had no heir. Samwise, come to him in just a moment, gets married at the end to his hobbit girlfriend, Rose or Rosie, and you got to read the appendix of The Lord of the Rings to see that they outdid the DeYoungs, and they had 13 children. The book is anti-statist, anti-communist, anti-socialist. He said in one place, this is in a letter, my political opinions lean more and more to anarchy, philosophically understood, meaning abolition of control, not whiskered men with bombs. And so he pictures Hobbiton as largely self-governed. He has a just war ethic. Remember, Gandalf is often having to tell people, no, you have to go and fight. He has to rouse them to fight. And I would argue, as others have, that the main hero of the story is not actually Frodo, but Sam. He is certainly the one we are meant to relate to. Sam Wise comes from Old English, Sam meaning half. His name is half-wise, half-wit, dim-wit. So his name means someone that you expect very little. He's dull. He's half-wise. And we meet him eavesdropping by the window. He's clumsy, inarticulate. He doesn't have the sophistication, the intellectual curiosity of Frodo or Bilbo. Tolkien said later, Samwise is one of those Batmen from the trenches in World War I. The common English soldier who does as he's told and is loyal to the very end. And his name, Gamgee. Remember, Tolkien is from Birmingham. There's a doctor, Joseph Sampson Gamgee, from Birmingham. In 1880, he invents surgical gauze, surgical material that would be used, and it was, you can Google it, it was called Gamgee tissue. One way to think of Sam is as the healing balm for Frodo's soul. Frodo is a fixed point. Sam develops. Sam grows, matures. He ends up a picture of bravery, nobility, purity. Some have said a Catholic vision would be of St. John standing at the foot of the cross as Jesus bears the penalty for sin. You also have to recognize it is a very English story and an English ending. Tolkien said one time he wrote The Lord of the Rings because the Scottish and the Irish and the French and the Germans and the Welsh all had their stories, but the English didn't. He wanted to dedicate the Silmarillion to Queen Elizabeth, and he wanted to give this inscription, quote, "The only thing in which your country is not rich is mythology." He wanted to make a myth for the English people. And so the ending, we think of the climax and destroying the ring, and then the movie goes on, and there's 5 different endings. But it ends with Sam, after they say goodbye to Frodo at the Grey Havens, and they come back, and it is a picture of the good life in Hobbiton. Hearth and home, wife and children, food, drink, a peaceable, productive life. The book is about fighting for your home and then coming home and enjoying it. Here's how the book ends. At last they rode over the downs and took the east road, and then Merry and Pippin rode on to Buckland. And already they were singing again as they went, but Sam turned to Bywater, and so came back up the hill as day was ending once more. And he went on, and there was yellow light and fire within, and the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in, and set him in his chair, and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. The end. It's a beautiful ending about returning home and enjoying this beautiful countryside and the gifts of family and children and food. Sam is the everyman who, from sheer loyalty, determination, and courage, proves to be as valuable or more so than those who have supernatural insight or muscular strength or magical powers. He represents freedom and the ordinary delights of life. He eats, he works, he has children, he enjoys his garden. The hobbits, this is good when we think about what makes a hero. The hobbits are heroes mainly because they're humble. Remember, they're halflings. They don't think much of themselves, and this is especially so of Sam. Well, let me end with this. The most important nonfiction thing that Lewis wrote, or Tolkien wrote, is an essay called On Fairy Stories. Fairy Stories. It was based on lectures he gave at St. Andrews in 1938. And here he argues, he calls them fairy stories. We would say fairy tales. He says, a fairy tale, he said, the best word we have to describe it is magic, but don't think of conjurers and illusionists. Think of creating a world, a self-contained world, where some of the characters can bring out beauty and bring out evil by an act of the will. That's the magic. And Lewis likened his own work as a sub-creator. He said that's what we do when we write literature. God is the creator, we're sub-creators. In fact, Lewis, now he didn't think he was writing the Bible, of course, but later in life he became adamant that he didn't write The Lord of the Rings. He was merely writing down what God had given to him as the story unfolded. He didn't even know how it was going to. One day he was grading papers, which no teacher likes grading papers. I'll teach for free. I cost a lot to grade papers. And he got to a blank page, and he wrote down on this blank page, where's the exact line, but you know it. In the ground, in a hole, there lived a hobbit. He said, I never even heard the word before. I didn't know what a hobbit was, but I wrote it down. He was a sub-creator. He said the best fairy stories deal with simple, fundamental things. He disagreed strongly with those who thought they're just for children. Or one of the charges often was that it was escapist literature. And he says, well, there are many things we need to escape from. There are people out to get us, things we must survive. There's evil to conquer. And he said, then there's the great escape, the escape from death. He said, the high point of a tragedy or a drama is tragedy. The best drama is a tragedy. But he said, the high point of a fairy tale is the happy ending. He called it famously, maybe you've seen this, a eucatastrophe. This prefix eu from the Greek means good, a good catastrophe. He said there's a sudden turn. There's a sudden miraculous supernatural intervention. There's a defeat. He said it is the evangelium, the good news that gives a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond this world. That's what he was trying to do with fairy tales. So think about this here as we close, that these last several weeks are all about people trying to respond to this new thing called modernism. So you have Neo-Calvinism, Bavinck and Kuyper saying we can be orthodox and modern. Something's changed, but we can hold on to orthodoxy. You have Machen who's saying, well, modernism has given way to Christianity, to liberalism, and that's not Christianity. You have, last week, Amy Simple McPherson, Pentecostalism. That's a response to modernism. We are going to be even more supernatural, and we're also going to pull from modern Hollywood entertainment. Well, here's another approach to modernism. Tolkien and Lewis tried to subvert the siren song of modernism by telling a better story. And in a world destroyed by 2 world wars, almost, ravaged by machines, as Tolkien saw it, led astray by the overpromises of science, forgetful of ancient beauty, Tolkien made the story of Christianity appealing by demonstrating it to be the greatest and most conceivable eucatastrophe. He said, there is no tale ever told that men would rather find true than Christianity, and none which so skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. Tolkien says, think about your favorite fairy tale. Imagine if you found out that that was true. Now think of the best story of all and to realize it is true. This story is supreme and it is true. Art has been verified. God is the Lord of angels and of men and of elves. Legend and history have met and fused. Well, was it all escapist literature? Maybe so. But as Tolkien once quipped to C.S. Lewis, the people that most hate escapism are jailers. See you next week.